All right, everyone. I am filling in for Carrie. Carrie's out under the weather today, so I will be filling in for her. I'd like to introduce and get the lecture series started. Ashley Dimick is the Crosman Gallery Director at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. There, she oversees both the Crosman Gallery and the Community Engagement Center Gallery, and also teaches art history in the Department of Art and Design. After completing her PhD in the history of art at the University of Michigan in 2019, she worked as the interim curator of Islamic art at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Her fields of specialization include the art and architecture of the Islamic world, particularly Turkish and Persian spheres during the early modern and modern periods. With a fine arts background in fiber arts and weaving, Dimick is especially interested in textiles across the Islamic world. Dimick has served on a number of professional boards. She has published in various scholarly journals and edited volumes, and she has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the residencies at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations in Istanbul. Dimick also holds 2 Masters of Art degrees from Indiana University, Bloomington, and Koç University in Istanbul, as well as the Director of Fine Arts degrees from I'm sorry, as well as the Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the Kansas City Art Institute. Let's welcome Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the volume good? Excellent. I tend to shout when I'm talking about textiles, so hopefully I'm not pounding in your ears. Yes, so I'm actually originally from Milton. Ancestry.com tells me I'm an 8th generation resident of Rock County, so I am very much local born and bred, but as Brian just read, I didn't live here for almost 20 years. So I left the state for college and then graduate school, traveled the world, accumulated many degrees and different kinds of experiences and expertise before seeing this job opening at UW-Whitewater here. So it was a bit of a homecoming for me last year when I moved here. Did anybody remember me from last year? I also spoke about Ottoman tents. Oh, good. Hi. It's nice to see you again. Great. So there will be a few tents in here, but that was a really specific topic related to my dissertation. Today, I'm going to talk about something much broader, which is really just textiles in the Islamic world. And as Brian said, this kind of is a confluence of things for me personally as someone who's studied the art of making textiles and weaving. I have years of experience doing that. And then studying from the art historical side, arts of the Islamic world. And so the intersection of those is really where my heart is at academically. Apologize for the unwieldy title, but I love an alliteration, and I actually made it worse. So I made it a little bit longer. We'll be talking about a few more things. So we'll talk about the Kaaba, which I'll explain what that is, calligraphy, kaftans, canopies, and carpets. So there's your really unwieldy alliteration. But I'll get started with essentially what are textiles, which I think is important to take a beat and really understand what it is we're talking about from a material perspective. And then what is the Islamic world? That's also a really loaded term, and then really spend the bulk of this looking at different examples and thinking about why are textiles important in Islamic cultures, in the Islamic faith, in the Islamic world, and how are they meaningful? How does a piece of fabric bear meaning as art, as a souvenir, as a trophy, as so many different things? So we'll see a lot of different examples here. We'll begin with a little entree here into what textiles are. And it might seem obvious at first blush, but once you get into the nitty-gritty of it, you're like, okay, wait a minute, well, where is the line between textiles and is bark cloth a textile? Felt isn't woven, but it's still a textile. So these kind of, because it's such a broad category, but ultimately you're taking some kind of material, typically from animals, plants, and more modern synthetic fibers, and interlacing them, knotting them, looping them, or weaving them in some fashion to create like a planar, flexible material. So we typically get fibers, and we'll see several different kinds of these over the course of the lecture. Wool, obviously, of all different types, not just sheep, but camels, llama, alpaca. I'm giving just a few little images here of, we got a cashmere goat and an Angora rabbit, all kinds of wonderful furs that come from animals. And this is really one of the things, especially in the pre-modern world, people would take the fibers from their local sources, right? So cotton grows in India, so there is a great cotton production center there, right? Musk ox are found in mountains and high-level areas, so that's where you're gonna get the use of musk ox fiber. It's very localized. But, of course, that leads to really a global trade. I'm not gonna dwell too much on synthetic fibers because I won't be talking about them. What you take then when your fibers have been harvested from plants or animals, you have to process them. And this is really where, regardless of where you are in the world, the production of handmade textiles ends up being so incredibly expensive. Very often, especially silk and finely made fabrics are going to be worth more than their weight in gold. So textiles are an incredibly important, expensive, luxurious, time-consuming global commodity, in part because of all of the processes that you have to go through, from harvesting to processing, washing, carding or combing, spinning, dyeing, knitting, weaving, however you like to come up with your final product. So this is both very, very broad and somewhat specific, which is why I wanted to make sure that we have kind of in mind the different potential materials and construction techniques as we look at several different examples. If you look closely in the very bottom corner, that's me weaving, if you can see. 20 years ago, though. So what is the Islamic world? And this is a little bit more loaded, though, again, might seem simple at first blush. So presumably everyone in this room has heard of Islam as a religion, given that about 25% of the entire world is Muslim. But here we have a map, and it's a little bit deceiving here just because of North America here looks a little bit grayed out, but be sure that there are plenty of Muslims in this country here today and have been here for a very long time. Unfun fact, approximately we think 10 to 20% of enslaved Africans taken from West Africa and brought to this country to be enslaved were originally Muslim. So Muslims have been in this country as long as this country, and actually long before this was in fact a country. So America is very much part of the Islamic world. So how do we define this? And I'm bringing this up because the field that I study is called Islamic art. Now, this is the only field that is called that by a religion. Otherwise, you've got medieval art, which is typically European. You've got Chinese art, so that's kind of a nationality or an ethnicity, right? Islamic art is the only field within art history really defined by or named for a faith. You don't get Christian art, right? That's a whole bunch of things. Well, the problem is that Islamic art is a whole bunch of things as well. And so it's a little bit difficult to have this kind of large, unwieldy category that is termed for a religion, even though what we mean when we say Islamic art, what we really mean is any art in any material, including textiles, any art made by Muslims, for Muslims, or in a Muslim majority country, culture, civilization, which is a lot of things. It can be something totally political and not religious, but it could be a Quran as well. So it's an all-encompassing category that happens to be termed and defined by a faith. So it's a little bit of a knot. I love a textile pun. So let's look at then, we can start with the center of the Islamic world. And primarily, I will be sticking within the darkest green zones here. This is where what we think of as like the Middle East, North Africa, those terms have changed because of shifting political situations over centuries. But that's generally the kind of birthplace of Islam, even though today it is very much a global religion. So, at the very center of the Islamic world is the Great Mosque of Mecca. So, the city of Mecca is where the Great Mosque of Mecca is, and within the Great Mosque is the Kaaba. And what that is this, I'm not tethered to anything, no. This very large cuboid structure. It's not quite perfectly a cube, but Kaaba literally means cube in Arabic. And this is the holiest shrine within Islam. The Kaaba existed as a temple of pagan idols before the Prophet Muhammad came to the fore in the 7th century, but he cleansed it of idols and consecrated it for a monotheistic one God. And since then, it has served as that holiest shrine for Muslims globally. And this is where, if you're going to embark upon Hajj or pilgrimage, this is where you're going to go, participate in certain rituals, and is seen as several things, kind of the house of God on earth, the kind of holy of holies, the omphalos, the navel of the universe. So it's really this center point. And as you can see here, the concentric rings around the Kaaba, those are rows of humans. So I always tell my students to look for the people in pictures. It will give you a good sense of the scale of something. And so here you can see that it is actually quite enormous, as you have these thousands of people in their white pilgrimage robes circumambulating it, so moving around it, and it creates this kind of vortex around this center point of the world. Now, what we're actually looking at, though, is not the cube. We're not actually looking at the Kaaba. The black here is silk. It's covered in an enormous textile called the kiswa. Here's a detail, and here again you can see the scale of it. These are humans down at the very foot of the Kaaba, at the very bottom of the door. And you can see here that it is this is absolutely enormous black silk textile embellished with beautiful silver and gold calligraphy. And I'll show you a few details here in a moment. Now, the really cool thing about this is that this is actually remade every single year. This huge, monumental silk, gold, and silver embroidered textile is brand new every single year. There's a whole kind of company or workshop that is dedicated to the creation of the kiswa annually, and it takes them upwards of 8 months, so the majority of the year, to create the new kiswa each and every year. And, wait, I'll leave that and for a moment. Excellent question. We'll get to that. So it is very, I want to use the word conservative, but I mean like it is generally the same every year, but there are differences. All of the calligraphy, as you might imagine, are excerpts from the Quran. And you can see here some of the folks in that workshop working on the new one for the next year. And here's maybe a better detail where you can actually see onto the black silk, which we'll have a better picture of this in a minute. But what's actually happening here is a bundle of yellow silk threads being laid down and a fine gold flat kind of wire being sewn over it to create a relief effect so that when sunlight hits the metal, it just is illuminate. And in Islam, God's presence visually is often shown through the presence of light. So it's very metaphorical in the materiality of it. Now, the embroidery and the weaving and the embroidery happen within the workshop, but the assemblage actually happens on site. They drape the Kaaba with the new kiswa each year and sew on the large embroidered panels onto the base of the black silk. But you'll see now with this image, it's not plain black silk. The black silk is actually woven with Quranic verses arranged in a chevron pattern. And this has been around for several centuries, but not since time immemorial. But let's look at, I'm bringing back this to remind you of the door, the curtain door here momentarily, because if we look at one from over 400 years ago, it is indeed a very similar composition. Now, of course, there's a few key differences here. We've got a lot of black silk still, a lot of gold embroidery still, but we've got some inclusion of red and green. Green being a color of Islam, a symbol of the Prophet, and red being an imperial color. These two combined are a really hallmark of the Ottoman Empire, who ruled Mecca at the time in the 1600s. And while today the Saudis, because Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, rule over the city of Mecca, it's their responsibility and honor to create the new kiswa every year. That costs, wait a minute, I had a $4.5 million every year to create it. So it's the responsibility of the Saudis now, but several hundred years ago, from 1517 to 1920s, it was the responsibility of the Ottoman sultans to create this kiswa. And here we're seeing a fragment of the overall kiswa, but this is the cutout of the curtain doorway. And this particular one is in the Khalili collection in London. He's a great art collector. They don't have kind of a brick and mortar museum as of yet, but they're working on it. But I did get to go behind the scenes and see a few things there, which also answers the question of the "and" that I left you hanging on a moment ago about what happens to the old ones when you have to make a new one every year, right? They're actually cut up after they've served their purpose for a year as the kiswa on the Kaaba and distributed to pilgrims. But because the textile has been draped over the Holy of Holies, right, it is saturated with the divine presence. And so it becomes a perfect souvenir for any faithful visiting Mecca. Now, the larger fragments, again, this is going to be quite a large piece here, go to, at least in the 17th century, would go back to sultans or high members. You get small fragments of things for kind of more of your everyday pilgrim. But the coolest part, when I went to see, I was actually going to the Khalili collection for different reasons to see some of my tents, but they were like, oh, we got a section of the most recent Kaaba. They had just cut it up, and I was like, oh, let me see. And so they took me into their vault, and as soon as they opened the door, I was about knocked on my feet with the smell of it, because it is perfumed and incensed and is just absolutely saturated with these aromatics that are associated with paradise in Islam. And so this brings me to one of my working hypotheses that one day I'll publish on, as to why are textiles so important and so significant in Islam. I think part of it, at least in this context, is their ability to absorb, right? We've all been somewhere where maybe there wasn't so much pleasant smells around and your clothes kind of stink then afterward. We know, right, that textiles absorb that scent. And so in the context of creating souvenirs for pilgrims to take with them their experience of the divine in Mecca, having that scent, and I think we all know too the connection between scent and memory. It's all very visceral and intertwined, and textiles are, of course, also very intimate in that we wear them on our bodies, which we'll see a few examples of here in a moment. There's a little bit of a detail for you. I think, remember the zigzag. We'll come back to that. Of course, though, it's not only in Islam that religious, sacred objects are veiled in some way, right? Here we have an example of a Torah ark curtain, though stylistically, compositionally, even color-wise, this is quite reminiscent also of prayer rugs. And this is where we really see, so this of course is also within the Ottoman Empire, just made for and by a Jewish community, but very much in conversation with carpets being made for Muslim prayer. And I think, I'm sure everyone has heard of the concept of a prayer rug, but what a prayer rug actually does is create for you, as you're praying or before you pray, creates a ritually cleansed space. So no matter where you are in the world, whether in a mosque or at the mall, I've seen that happen before, you can roll your rug out and it creates a sacred space from wherever you are because of the textile. And especially, and very often, or pretty much almost exclusively, you'll see prayer carpets have a single arch here. We have a triple arch because it's extra fancy. But typically you have a single arch, and that arch is oriented pointing toward Mecca. So it gives you this kind of grounding in place and connects you directionally to the Holy of Holies as well, through orientation as well as through the textile medium. Another way that textiles are able to connect kind of the person, connect places, people around the world back to Mecca, was developed by the Ottomans. And here we have a fragment, though it has been backed and seamed in the intervening centuries, a fragment of part of a kiswa, or potentially the covering. They also similarly weave a new covering for the prophet's tomb, and has a very similar composition with the calligraphy arranged in that chevron pattern. So one of the two holiest places in Islam, potentially, but this came from one of those and had been cut up and reused in a funerary context. So this would have been draped over the cenotaph or the grave marker of somebody very important within the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan certainly would have had these, but this is a relatively modest one. It could have been, and by modest I mean just in scale, it could have been for a much smaller cenotaph, which might not necessarily denote a smaller person, but a less important person. It was very hierarchical in that regard. But this essentially would have been a way to connect the deceased with the Holy of Holies. And because the Quranic inscriptions here speak of the Shahada, which is the proclamation of faith, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. That's what you have to say to essentially accept Islam and become a Muslim. So it's extremely important and really iconic in a lot of visual arts. But you have that here then draped over essentially the deceased to connect them to God, to the Holy of Holies, to the Kaaba, through that, both visually with the chevron and the calligraphy, and materially with the textile itself. So having absorbed the holiness of those sites, then you can transport them to your grave. There's another detail of that. Over the outside, we're going to look at a couple textiles that are close to the body in funerary context, but these ones are draped over. The cenotaphs are actually really interesting. They're long, okay, like picture like a casket or something, but with like a pitched roof. And so they're actually, they hang like that over large cenotaphs. But to continue a little bit on this theme of the power of textile and how essentially it can absorb and transfer power, in the Islamic world that's called barakah, or blessing, God's blessing. So it's that sort of divine power that you can wield through material objects. Here we have an example of a talismanic shirt, and these you can find kind of across the Islamic world, but especially the Ottoman Empire and India in the early modern period. And this one in particular is cotton from India, and on it is written the entirety of the Quran in absolutely minuscule script. You might not even be able to recognize it as script, but this is all script. So this entire garment contains the entirety of the Quran. And that is, again, taking the power of God's word in that way and applying it to your body. A background of the Quran. There is sometimes, a way to kind of translate it to primarily Christian context and saying, well, it's like the Bible for Muslims. That's really not the case. The best analogy I've heard, though it's still not perfect, is that the Quran is not the Bible. It's actually more akin to Christ himself, because the Quran is the physical manifestation of God on earth. So it's closer to Christ than the Bible as such in the belief system. Very interestingly, the Quran, unlike the Bible, which was, edited and translated and books taken in and out, the Council of Nicaea and all of that, the Quran has never changed. It is word for word from the first time it was written down in Arabic to the present day. And it was written down within a couple of decades of the prophet's life rather than centuries like the Bible. So it is immutable, and even if you have like an English translation of the Quran, it is said to be an interpretation. It is not like the real thing. To be able to read the Quran, you have to read Arabic, because Arabic is believed to be the language of God. So when you wield the Quran in this way and write it fully on a textile and embody the Quran literally by wearing it, it's quite a powerful thing indeed. And this particular garment, these were usually worn under armor in battle as a means of spiritual protection. And this one was indeed worn. Got some pit stains that have slightly erased some of the Quran. But you can see maybe a little bit better here the script running that way and that way. This is a sidebar, like in relation to this. A person who has memorized the Quran, like a Hojja or Haji, is also like a physical embodiment of the Quran in a way. So I wonder if somebody like that wore something like this, you're like doubling up the Quran's power within yourself. It's quite powerful, not to be redundant. But this idea where we can imbue a material object, and in particular textile, with divine power through the written word really happens, like I said, across the Islamic world. And in this context, we're in West Africa, in Senegal, where we have here similarly Quranic passages and different kind of sort of power elements, if I can say this. So stitched onto it are these little pockets of powerful materials, and we don't know what's in there to this day because we're not going to open them. But very often with these small amulets, you'll have little scraps of the Quran folded up and sewn in there. They're not to be read, but they're meant to wield that power nevertheless. And you get also these kinds of diagrams, which, if you have a weaver's brain, you're looking at plain weave, but it's just a diagram. They're often called magic squares, but it's about, again, sort of wielding the visual to your own benefit. All right, I promised you textiles that were worn against the body. Now these, I did give when I talked about these with my students, I did give them a little bit of a trigger warning because the stains on here are decomposition fluids. This is what we call a Taraz textile. These came out primarily from Egypt, where they survived quite well. As I think we all know, the desert climate of Egypt preserves things really, really well, which is why we have so much from ancient Egypt as well as medieval Egypt. These were primarily, and they would have been worn in life as well as death, but the ones that survived to us were protected in burial contexts. They were then removed from burial contexts by licit and illicit means and came on the art market about 100 years ago. Now, a whole Taraz cloth would have been just plain linen and with just that single band, or later they ended up being multi-band, multiple bands of inscription and decoration. But this is a pretty classical Taraz fabric. And once they were taken out of the graves, they were cut out and just kept the sort of decorative part to be sold on the art market. And you get a lot of these in art museums that have Islamic collections as well, including the Met, as we have here. As I said, they were worn in life as well as death, and the inscriptions on here vary widely. Sometimes it's just the same word repeated. Sometimes, like this, it is a whole paragraph of bestowing good wishes or what have you on the wearer. Other times, it's not legible at all, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the word tiraz, where we get that, is actually, tiraz is the Persian word for embroidery. And indeed, this is blue silk embroidered onto an undyed linen cloth. However, not all tiraz ended up being embroidered. As the years went on, there's a detail there, it manifested in multiple different ways. Sometimes they were tapestry woven, so not embroidered. Sometimes they were painted on, but they still became associated with this concept of tiraz. So while the word originally meant embroidery, it came to mean a textile with an inscription on it. This example is one of my favorites because it is actually ikat dyed. And I think I have another example of ikat dye here. But so what we mean by ikat dye is that when the threads were laid out onto the loom, they would have been resist dyed by bundling up, tying those threads to resist taking dye, and each color then would have been a different dye bath, and you'd have to untie and retie everything and then make sure it gets back on the loom in order for a pattern to be able to emerge like this. So it's highly time-consuming and very intense skill that you need to develop kind of over generations. And tiraz from Yemen almost always bore this type of ikat patterning. So if you see one with this kind of ikat patterning, most likely from Yemen. And here we have the inscription, such as it is, painted on with gold and outlined in black ink. However, this is not actually legible. This is not Arabic. This is squiggle lines made to look like Arabic, which is a whole interesting phenomenon in global art. We typically refer to this as pseudo-Arabic. Decades ago, people referred to it as pseudo-Kufic, which is a bit of a misnomer. So pseudo-Arabic, meaning fake Arabic or meant to look like Arabic. Now, that phenomenon, this goes across all different kinds of media, this concept of pseudo-Arabic, and it can happen for many different reasons. Maybe your craftsman actually wasn't literate. Maybe it just didn't matter. Maybe it just needed to look like Arabic to be able to still wield that power that the written word of Arabic had the power to do. And this is something that I think a lot of scholars are still uncomfortable with. They're like, well, but if it doesn't mean anything, what is it doing? But I think it still has meaning as the symbolic word of God or the language of God, even if it is not necessarily legible. Here's just another example of ikat. I think you start to see a lot of things like this at like Home Goods lately, but this is a Central Asian Uzbek women's robe. Now, why am I showing you this? A little bit of a left turn here from Yemen in the 9th century. But looking at our one of our early Renaissance masters here, Giotto, from Florence in the late 13th, early 14th century, we have a depiction here of the Virgin and Child, who are in the Quran. Also, I'll say that the Quran contains, Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and all of the cast of characters that we get in the Old Testament. Mary is the only woman named, by name in the Quran, and Jesus goes by Isa in the Bible or in the Quran, who is also considered a prophet in Islam. But in this context, we're very much still in Christian Europe here. But if you notice something about Mary's robe, which is always, it's depicted as blue, a symbol of, femininity and purity. But the gold edge around her robe bears a pseudo-Arabic inscription. Why? Any guesses? Can we make this a discussion? Can I start asking you questions? Ooh, cover all bases. Yeah, and I will say too that in the life of Mary, Arabic didn't exist as a written language yet. Arabic only came to be a written language when Islam became a religion. So the Quran was really also the linguistic codification of that language, and therefore is like the main grammar book of Arabic as well as the Quran. Right. So it's not as though this is hearkening back to an earlier age. Arabic didn't exist as such in the life of Mary and Jesus. But what it did do for Renaissance Christian artists was associate this figure with the Middle East. Yes. So even though it was from another time, having Arabic inscription around her, or pseudo-Arabic in this case, though sometimes you do see it as legible Arabic, associated Mary with the place, even if not the time, associated her with the place of where they were from in the Levant and what is today the Middle East. It's just a fun little cross-cultural thing that we don't often acknowledge, I think. Now, there are also examples of very deliberate uses of this technique. And so we're still on the theme here of textiles with calligraphy of various sorts. And here again is an example of something that's maybe a little bit between cultures, but that's where I think interesting things happen. Here we have the mantle, or sort of regal robe of Roger II. He was the Norman king of Sicily in the medieval period. And so Sicily being that perfect central place in the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea would have been in contact with everything surrounding it, Muslim and Christian cultures alike. So visually here, we've got a pointed statement in the depiction of what we have here. And if you can see this, we've got symmetrical composition with a tree of life in between two sort of heraldic animals. But we have here a lion, long associated with kingship for thousands of years, tackling, claws out, a camel. Maybe not a very subtle message in the medieval Mediterranean as a Christian king with very close neighbors who are Muslim and have camels, right? So very, very direct visual message. And yet, what do we have around the edge? A legible Arabic inscription stitched on in gold with pearl accents, because of course. So I'll read this in its entirety because it's, or at least in part here. So this belongs to the articles worked in the Royal Workshop, so we know who made it, with industry and perfection, might and merit, so they're really laying it on thick to complement themselves, but also kind of telling you that they're worthy to do this for the king, with success and sincerity, triumph, and industry. So also thinking of sort of demonstrating that, being victorious over their eastern neighbors. And indeed, it is in Arabic. So who is it speaking to? Not the locals necessarily, though some of them may speak Arabic, but it's speaking to the others, right? Their neighbors. Interestingly enough, though, Roger II and the Norman kings after him employed many Muslim Arab craftsmen in his court, and so much of his art and architecture really looks Islamic. And so it actually is this weird negotiation. And so you could almost think of him as a Christian European ruler kind of co-opting this Islamic visual language and the meaning of Arabic and of textiles for his own gain. So it's maybe not, the sincerest form of flattery kind of thing, more about, oh, this is now mine. I am taking kind of dominion over this type of artistic style and language. It's a negotiation. How are we doing on time? Ooh. I have to go much faster if I want to talk about everything. Sorry. I have to certainly spend a little bit of time, though, on Safavid textiles. Safavid Empire ran from, 1501 to 1722, if I'm remembering my dates right, was a massive, just beautiful empire ruling over not just Iran, but so much of the area around it. So in the early modern era you've got like the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey, the Safavid Empire based in Iran, and the Mughal Empire based in India. These three massive empires that were great patrons of the arts and architecture. And in Safavid Iran, there was incredible innovation and skill in weaving figural textiles. So these are not tapestries, which can be very fine. They're not knotted work, which can also be very fine. But those are, it's structurally quite simple, even if it is very fine work. This is entirely made using the loom mechanism and combining multiple complex weaves with multiple supplemental warps and multiple supplemental wefts. I think the only culture that even can rival this at all would be Andean textiles. These are the two that have such complex weaving techniques that it's almost we're not even able to quite understand the full complexity of it, even in the modern era. But here we have another very political message wielded in the form of textiles. We have here, I think it's a detail, the color is not great, but it gives you a closer image here of what we're looking at, as well as a little bit of the texture. But even still, just imagining how you can create such a fine line in woven material that is dictated by the grid of the loom is phenomenal. But we have here is a prisoner situation, prisoner of war specifically, after the Safavids won a battle against the Georgians, I think it was. And so you start to see images of Georgian captives. Again, this is propaganda. This isn't a perfect image, but you can see here a figure in a painting wearing a very similar kaftan with dragging these prisoners along. And so and you see a painting like this and you're like, okay, maybe that's fanciful. No, they actually had kaftans with that kind of intricate patterning. And also we'll go back to this. A loom is based on a repeat as well. And the way that they're able to reflect it, so this pattern, single unit, is moving this direction and then back this direction, and it's staggered to create something that is not as visually repetitive, that it looks like a whole composition unto itself. I'm going to go past that one quick because I want to get to this, which is one of my favorite kaftans. I would die to see this in person. Pretty sure it's in Russia, though, so that's not going to happen anytime soon. But it has on there one of the stories from the Shahnameh, which is the Persian Book of Kings. And it's about the grandson of the first king, these primordial kings, talking about sort of the origins of civilization. And the grandson of the first ever king in Persian mythology is Husheng. And he is credited with inventing fire. And we have here a scene where Husheng, if I can kind of point him out, he's here in the fold. You see his back leg here and the other direction here. But he's holding a rock over his head to defend himself against this dragon, which very much looks like a Chinese dragon, to slay the dragon with a rock because, this is a primordial time. That's the only weapon he had. But the rock struck another rock, sparked, and invented fire. Or discovered fire. And that's sort of in Persian mythology, the origin of fire, which also relates to the dragon. It's very complex. Here we have another painting, though, of an Englishman who was an ambassador from from the Persian Shah back to England, and came home wearing multiple layers of the finest Safavid figural textiles, constructed into a very elaborate, multi-layered garment, turban included. And you see here, it's actually in a different colorway, but the exact same composition as the robe that survives in Russia. So we've got Husheng here lifting up the rock over his head, and the spine of the dragon you can see there. But this gives us one of the other amazing uses of textiles, which is not just as payment. Rulers would give textiles as forms of payment to their courtiers and ambassadors and such things, but they were also diplomatic gifts. And here we actually have, this is a multi-layered one where you have a Persian velvet kaftan that was gifted to the Queen of Sweden by the Russian Tsar, who had gotten it from Iran. And I love these kind of multiple layered stories where you get different chapters in the life of an object as it travels over time and in different hands and worn by different remarkable figures, as in this case. I want to get to my tents. So I want to make sure that I have a little bit of time to talk about tents and carpets here. I have 3 tents, one from each of those cultural spheres I talked about. So this one from India, the next one will be from Iran, and the last one from the Ottoman Empire. And here we have one of the best preserved, earliest surviving tents called the Red Tent from Mughal India. And this one I think is remarkable. I think I have another image. There you can see some of the detail. This is velvet, which if you know anything about velvet is the structure of velvet consumes the most amount of material. Like if you're weaving with silk, it takes so much more than any other kind of weave structure. But I love this as there's multiple layers kind of entry here. But if you imagine the ruler sitting with inside it, it's kind of framing him and his viewscape, which very much relates to, I think, hard architecture as well. You get these kind of similar constructions because hard architecture and soft architecture are very much in conversation with one another. There is a better view of that. I know, I just spend hours with these things in the galleries. This was interesting. They had a virtual reality component to this where on an iPad you could place little Mughal rulers inside the tent, and so it would be as though you're seeing them occupying the space. It was very fun. This one is, I should say, now in Cleveland, if you're ever in that area. I'm not sure if it's currently on display, but it was certainly there not too long ago. I think they only acquired it 10 years ago. Smaller than some, but certainly no less elaborate. So here we have a conical sort of canopy tent with, there's another nice interior. These are all my shots. You can see here this one is primarily appliqued with corded embroidery highlighting all of the different outlining all of the different elements of the applique. And then if you were here for my talk last year, this is the tent that ended up in the Nazi movie theater, if you remember that. Fun story. This one is in Poland today. This is the same tent under very different lighting. And then the ceiling of it. I'm going quicker now. These are just, I've spent over 15 years now studying these things. They're absolutely incredible. And it's another form of, like, going back to the Kaaba, another form of monumental art, textiles. Textiles are creating and recreating space and environment as well as the sacred. It's just all-encompassing in so many ways. This is a different tent, but I think it gives you a much better visual of the texture and the layers of the embroidery, even the individual stitches. Now, the tent making is actually still an art form practiced today, especially in Cairo, in the Hayamia district. It's a street in Cairo, and here's an exhibition of their work from 2016. And here you can see, this is the street, the tent maker's street, and here we have, I saw this a demonstration, he was demonstrating in Minnesota at the quilt show there. But here you can see the different kinds of panels and then how little mock-ups of how they could be constructed into tents so that you can order your own as you like it. And I just love this. Tent making is a men's art form, I will say, especially in the Islamic world. There are other art forms, other textile arts that are done primarily by women, but the applique tents are a men's art. And if you're interested, there is a documentary on them called The Tent Makers of Cairo that won a fair amount of awards. To really quickly talk about carpets. Carpets actually might be one of the things that is known best from the Islamic world, right, in our culture. They've been collected for a very long time, prized for a very long time. Here we have one of the most extraordinary carpets that's ever existed. They were a pair, one's in Los Angeles and one's in London. But note the dimensions here, so it's about 34 by 18 feet. With 300 to 350 knots per square inch. Yeah, it's really remarkable. So here you're seeing it, the one in London, and there is a replica that is in the original shrine that it was made for in Iran. Carpets as a commodity exchanged in Europe, used in different contexts. But I wanted to end on a couple examples of contemporary art here as well. And this is where my art historian brain needs to shift into thinking about, again, and this is what actually brings me to that question of why textiles? Why, especially in the Islamic world, are textiles wielded in so many different ways, especially politically, propaganda, religiously, with the sacred, and just love. I mean, there was one of the ones I passed by was a love story. They have such intimate meanings as well as global messages in so many different ways. It's almost infinite in what they can do. But here I have a couple examples of Faik Ahmed's work, who I'm a huge fan of. And he takes this concept of the very traditional Oriental carpet and then just undoes it before your eyes, essentially. He has other ones that look like they're computer glitches or things, and he just obfuscates what this global commodity is and sort of takes it over in a very modernist, surrealist sense. But there are also, we've looked primarily at the production of imperial workshops, very high level, highly funded art forms. But just as a kind of a brief nod to people making textiles for similar purposes, but in very different contexts. There is a genre of carpet known as the Afghan war rugs that came out of really the 90s and 2000s with Afghanistan first besieged by the Soviet Union and later the Taliban and the United States interventions and such, that they have been producing carpets to tell their story about what's happening on the ground there to an international audience, because these then are traded internationally. And if you notice, the one on the right there is written in English, or at least primarily in English. So again, like the Arabic inscription before, is a who is this speaking to? Who is the audience for this? And it is very much an international audience, using textiles as a means to kind of cry out in some ways and bring to light the state of affairs, which has only gotten worse since these were made. All right, I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but I'm also happy to stay a few minutes late if anyone wants to. Yeah.
That's also what Hmong textiles do.
The war imagery?
Storytelling.
Oh, storytelling for sure. Yeah. Ooh.
Migration imagery.
Yeah. Ooh. Okay. If you have any artist names, I would love to.
I don't know them.
Just 1 second here.
Oh, sorry.
Nope, we have to get. So it's
Oh, so it's recorded. Hi.
As you know, there's now a movement in the art world to get objects of art, and you mentioned the V&A in London, to get art objects back to their original countries. Can you speak to that, what that means for textiles?
Absolutely. This is a huge.
And actually, real quick, there are some people that did drive here. We do have some very severe weather that is going to be impacting us very soon. So if you, not
Yeah,
cut
I'm
out
like, I gotta
better
go home
answer,
too.
but I know some of you did drive here, so that might be something you might want to take into consideration.
A tornado? What do we got?
Rock County.
Great.
So
where I'm going to.
I think we'll probably end it here because I know some people are wanting to leave. Let's thank Ashley for the program. Please do drive safe for those that are going to be out.
You just gave me an idea. Maybe next year I'll talk a whole lecture about that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Because I'm working with my students on that.